Freedom is not an accident of history. It is the result of ideas tested over time, shaped by debate, and sustained by institutions and citizens willing to defend them. The United States was founded on an audacious premise that a free people could govern themselves, that liberty could endure not through force, but through law. Not through unanimity, but through argument.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
And not through tradition alone, but continued renewal. Across generations, Americans have wrestled with enduring questions. What does citizenship require? What responsibilities accompany freedom? How should power be restrained? And how should a free society respond to moments of danger, disruption, and change? Today, those questions are once again urgent. Democratic societies face pressure at home and abroad. New technologies are reshaping economies and institutions. Authoritarian systems challenge the principles of open societies. And Americans are called to reconsider how freedom can be preserved in a rapidly changing world. The Ideas That Made Us, Dialogues on Freedom, is dedicated to examining these challenges through serious inquiry and open debate. Across the year, the Hoover Institution will bring leading voices to explore the foundations of American freedom, from citizenship and education to innovation, governance, national security, and global competition. Each dialogue connects enduring principles to contemporary choices, asking not only where we have been, but where we're going. These conversations are not about prescribed dogma or doctrine. They are grounded in open, serious, and constructive dialogue. They are about a deeper understanding, and about responsibility, and about the ideas that have made the United States and will shape its future.
We often think of freedom as a universal aspiration, something that people have wanted at all times and in all places. But among ancient societies, it was really only the Greeks and the Romans, the progenitors of Western culture, who took a word that originally meant not enslaved and used it to mean not ruled by a tyrant. So they added a political meaning to the civil word for freedom. Today, we take it for granted that these two different meanings are naturally conjoined. But when the Declaration of Independence affirms that a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people, that's a proposition that many around the world would not have found obvious in 1776. It's a definition that has very specific Western roots. It's also an idea that lies at the heart of our current efforts to revive civic education. Political freedom is not a given. It takes work and a cultural foundation if we want it to last.
In advancing freedom, what role do traditions play? What are the main traditions that have shaped and will likely continue to shape America's story? Western civilization is certainly one. How, in fact, has Western civilization supported the cause of freedom, and how has it sometimes undermined that cause? Another tradition is the 18th century Enlightenment, when our republic was born. And that tradition, too, cuts in multiple ways. Some of our traditions are outright inimical to freedom, such as our history of slavery, over which we fought a civil war. All these traditions, as well as others, are contested, but without understanding our history, without debating it in all its dimensions, it is impossible to understand and therefore to advance freedom. Over the next 250 years, which traditions will endure and how might they evolve? How does the past help us understand America's possible futures, which are yet to be invented?
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you for joining us today as we engage the ideas that made us and take part in a dialogue on freedom.
Good evening. I'm Stephen Kotkin, and I'm the Klein-Heinz Senior Fellow here at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. On behalf of the Hoover Institution's director, Condoleezza Rice, I have the honor to welcome you all to the inaugural discussion of a year-long program on America at 250. Tonight's discussion is jointly sponsored by College 102, Stanford's freshman course on citizenship, by the Hoover History Lab, which uses history to address contemporary policy challenges, and by Stanford's Department of History. We are here with you to talk about America. Where do we come from? Where are we going? What is freedom? How do we advance freedom? Some traditions that make up America are recent. Some date back to the founding of the Republic and predate the Republic. All are contested as is appropriate in a democracy. The recent Super Bowl halftime show featured a performance almost entirely in the Spanish language by Bad Bunny. More than 128 million people watched that halftime show, slightly more than attend our classes. The halftime show spotlighted Puerto Rican heritage in the United States and beyond. That, too, is part of America. We mentioned Bad Bunny's performance not to endorse it, not to criticize it. Those judgments are for you to make. Instead, our first proposition to you is that before you can decide whether to endorse or criticize a tradition, you need to know America's traditions well. Our second proposition for you tonight is that if you do not know American traditions well, that would be on us, educators. That would be our fault. And so, on to Western civilization, the Enlightenment, slavery, and more. Please allow me to introduce tonight's moderator, Professor Jonathan Gunap, who has a joint appointment in the History Department and the Law School, and is a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution. Professor G, take it away.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks to the Hoover Institution and all the joint sponsors for putting this on this evening, and to all of you for being here. So it's a great privilege to have a chance to moderate this panel this evening on this occasion, this year in which we will reflect upon the 250th anniversary of the United States of America becoming a nation, to think deeply and seriously about its political, intellectual, and moral foundations, to think about where they came from, to think about the struggles over them, to think about the fundamental fights that they have provoked across time, and especially to think about what we today, 250 years later, might do with any of them, which of them need to be better understood, which perhaps have been forgotten and need to be revived, which should be perpetuated, which should be reformed, all central conversations to be having throughout this year and this evening. So I have the enormous privilege of moderating this panel made up of some of the most distinguished scholars and teachers here at Stanford, all of whom have a great deal to say about these particular themes. So our first speaker will be Barry Strauss, who is a distinguished military historian and Hoover Institution Senior Fellow, who has authored numerous best-selling books on ancient Greece and Rome during his decades-long career at Cornell University. Recently awarded the 2025 Bradley Prize, his extensive scholarship includes the recently published book, Jews versus Rome, and memberships in prestigious academic societies. Next, we will hear from Carolyn Winterer, who is the William Robertson Co-Professor of History and American Studies here at Stanford University, who specializes in the history of ideas, political thought, and science in America before 1900. She is the author of 6 books, including her latest work, How the New World Became Old, The Deep Time Revolution in America, and she teaches a variety of courses on the American Enlightenment and cultural history. After her will be Professor Dan Edelstein, who is the William H. Bonsall Professor of French and a Courtesy Professor of History and Political Science here at Stanford, where he also serves as a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and, as many of you know, directs the university's first-year general education requirement. He is primarily a scholar of European intellectual history. He has authored or edited 11 books, including his most recent book, The Revolution to Come. And then last but not least, Ann Twitty is also a professor here at Stanford in the history department and a prominent public historian of 19th century United States, who, among other things, has led major initiatives to contextualize the legacy of slavery and Confederate memory on university campuses. Beyond her research, she serves on the editorial board of the Journal of American Constitutional History and the board of the Freedom Suits Memorial Foundation. We will begin with Barry Strauss.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a great honor to be here this evening. So I want to begin by quoting that philosopher Monty Python, who asked in his magnum opus, The Republic, no, actually, it was The Life of Brian. He asked, and I think you all know the question, what have the Romans done for us? Well, this evening, I want to ask, what can the Romans do for us? And also, what can the Greeks do for us? Now, I'm a classicist, so I have a vested interest in the subject, but I want you to know that I'm not simply a blind admirer of the ancients. I know that the world they lived in was very imperfect. These are societies, Greece and Rome, that were based on unfree labor, enslaved labor, on serf labor. These are societies that engaged in militarism, imperialism, ethnocentrism, sexism, and not infrequently misogyny. They weren't perfect, but they do have some things to teach us and some things that they taught America in its 250 years. And I want to focus on 3 things in particular: on liberty, on eloquence, and on education. So, liberty. You already heard our video recite the famous lines from the Declaration of Independence. I'll read them again. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty is the central theme in this statement, not only because it comes in the middle, but because it is essential. And liberty was not just freedom from tyranny, of course, but freedom to participate. As the Declaration goes on to say, government depends on the consent of the governed. To have the consent of the governed, it means that you have to have citizens. And citizenship, as my colleague said, is not something to be taken for granted in every society. Citizenship was actually invented in ancient Greece, in Athens, in the 6th century BCE. And through Greece and Rome and down through the ages, it comes to us. Citizenship, it means liberty that is political liberty. It means the liberty to participate in the government, participate in the sense of, in the act of being self-governed. We get this from the Greeks, and it's immensely precious. Now, the second point I want to talk about is eloquence. The Declaration of Independence is a declaration, obviously. It's a manifesto. It's not a constitutional statute. It is highly rhetorical, and it uses some of the tropes of Greek and Roman rhetoric. It is, on the whole, deliberative rhetoric or political rhetoric. It's also forensic rhetoric. It's building a case, and the case is against poor King George, who the Declaration alleges was a tyrant. And it also engages in what the ancients called epidectic rhetoric, or ceremonial or showy rhetoric. It wants to state universal values, and you just heard the universal values that it stated. It's emotional, it's powerful, it's eloquent, and I submit it's unforgettable. But I'd like to move ahead. I'd like to set the clock forward by about 80 years, 77 years to be exactly, to the era of the Civil War and to the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. As you all know, after the battle came one of the most famous speeches in American history, the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln. Happy birthday, President Lincoln. Tomorrow is his birthday, February 12th. The Gettysburg Address is a funeral oration. It is a speech that commemorates those who died in battle. It states what the vision that they died for is, and it exhorts the listeners to continue the struggle. In doing this, Lincoln didn't choose this approach at random. Rather, he's following in a tradition that goes all the way back to democratic Athens again, because the Athenians, as a young democracy, invent the funeral oration. They're the first society in history to commemorate the soldiers who had died on behalf of their country. They have an annual ceremony when there was a war, and I'm afraid most years there was a war, to commemorate the dead. So Lincoln is following in these footsteps. The most famous such address, many of you will have heard of it, Pericles' funeral oration. It is an eloquent and formal speech, but it's also got what we would now call sound bites. Such things as Pericles saying, Athens is the school of Greece. And also, I'll translate freely, we love beauty without going overboard. We love wisdom without going soft. Now, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was in fact not the formal funeral oration on the occasion of the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. Lincoln's speech was meant just to be remarks. The formal address was given by the former president of Harvard, also the former governor of Massachusetts and a U.S. Senator, Edward Everett. And Edward Everett, in his speech, wanted to display his erudition, his knowledge of the ancients. Let me read a mercifully short excerpt. And shall I, fellow citizens, who after an interval of 23 centuries, a youthful pilgrim from the world unknown to ancient Greece, have wandered over that illustrious plain, ready to put off the shoes from off my feet, as one that stands on holy ground, who have gazed with respectful emotion on the mound which still protects the dust of those who rolled back the tide of invasion and rescued the land of popular liberty, of letters, and of arts from the ruthless foe. Well, I'll spare you. Lincoln does something different. Lincoln brings Everett's rhetoric down to earth. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. As you know, the Gettysburg Address is a very short speech. And afterwards, Everett confessed that Lincoln had done more to capture the spirit of the occasion in 2 minutes than Everett had done in 2 hours. That's how long he spoke for. Well, my third point is education. The ancients were great believers in education, and they believed in education as a form of liberation. Education as a way that would liberate us from our misconceptions, from our childish ideas, from our prejudices, and that would bring us to something better. I think there have been many people in history who've looked to education as a way to rise, a way to be liberated. And I think that in American history, one of the most moving examples of this is the case of African Americans after the Civil War. Understandably, the former slaves, when they were freed, wanted to be educated. As slaves, they were not allowed to be taught to read and write. And one of the former slaves says that what was heard as a cry from the freemen around the country, give us the spelling book. Give us the spelling book. There was a debate as to whether education for African Americans should be technical education or liberal education? Of course, we still have this debate today. Liberal education, what did it consist of in this period? It's a curriculum that was capped with higher mathematics, science, philosophy, and Latin and Greek. Most black high schools, teacher training colleges, and universities in the late 19th and early 20th century adopted such a curriculum. Why? And why especially Latin and Greek? Well, one reason was equality. The slave owners, and I'm afraid many white people, if not most, were firmly convinced that African Americans couldn't learn Greek and Latin. One who did, in the late 19th century, a man named Joseph Wright wrote about his own study of Latin and Greek. Most of us were firmly convinced that a Negro American had as much intellect as a white man, and that it was most sinful for whites to try to shackle our minds and put us under handicaps in order to take unfair advantage of us. Another, Joseph Thomas Wilson, published a book in 1887 called The Black Phalanx. The Black Phalanx. The phalanx is the characteristic infantry formation of ancient Greece, of the ancient Greek city-states. Wilson was a veteran of the Union Army, and he wanted to say that African Americans, because they had fought for their country, deserved all the rights of citizenship and equality. Alas, it took over a century for that to happen, and the struggle continues today, as you know. But one last quotation, this one from one of the preeminent intellectuals of the 20th century, another African American, W.E.B. Du Bois, who in his autobiography talked about how when he was young and learned Greek, how one of his proud moments was going to his church and translating an inscription on the wall of the church that said, "The truth shall make you free." And there's also his famous statement about the elevating power of the classics in his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk. "I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they all come graciously with no scorn or condescension. So wed with truth, I dwell above the veil." In conclusion, there are three things that the classics have to offer Americans as our country turns 250. Let's restore the centrality of citizenship as the guarantee of liberty and freedom. Let's return to the ennobling power of oratory, an oratory that while democratized and brought down from its highfalutin perch, is nonetheless eloquent and uplifting. And let's rededicate ourselves to the liberating quality of education, an education that must begin at the beginning of political liberty in Greece and Rome. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Barry, and hello to everybody. I see many students and some of my colleagues out there, and it's very kind of you to attend tonight, and very delighted to be speaking with you. You know, we hear a lot about the classicism of the American founders, of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, all of them steeped in classicism from their very cradles. George Washington never went to college, but he tried to make up for it by reading Greek and Latin classics in translation. But the other three that I mentioned all knew Greek and Latin as languages. And this intensive immersion in classical antiquity helped them when they turned their world upside down in 1776 by Brexiting from the British Empire and establishing one of the first modern republics in the history of the world. This was terrifying. This was unprecedented, and they didn't think that it would work. And that is one of the reasons why they grabbed so energetically at examples from ancient Greece and Rome for something, anything, a life raft, to tell them that this experiment in Republican government was going to last more than 2 or 3 minutes. That is why the United States Senate is called the Senate. It is named after the Senate of ancient Rome. It is why all of the federal buildings that were built after 1790 are in the image of ancient Greece and Rome. You can look all around you, even today, in our STEM-centered campus and our STEM-centered world, and still find reminders of the culture of classicism that the American founders were awash in. However, I am here to tell you that the so-called classical founding of the United States is in fact much broader geographically and chronologically than we have imagined. So for a moment, let's look beyond the classical world of the founders, beyond the Greece of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, and the ancient Rome of the virtuous republican period of the first roughly 500 years BC, and look at how American revolutionaries were inspired by much more distant regions of Mediterranean antiquity. For example, they loved ancient Carthage, the North African city-state that became the most powerful empire of the Mediterranean. It was the mighty rival to Rome for hundreds of years, and in fact dominated and crushed Rome in a number of battles until it too was annihilated by Rome in the last of the 3 Punic Wars. The founders loved ancient Carthage. James Madison studied it sedulously as he was preparing for the US Constitution, the convention in 1787, and to write the Federalist Papers that defended it. Why? Because Carthage had a model republic. They knew it from Aristotle and they knew it from Polybius. It was a balanced constitution, and they wanted to import that into the United States. So that's ancient Carthage. Second, they looked to the ancient Greek colonies before classical Greece of the 5th century. They looked to the archaic Greek colonies of the 8th to the 5th centuries, hundreds of them, spread like ants all over the ancient Greek world, far beyond the peninsula of Greece, all the way into Italy and Sicily, and even beyond, and all the way into Asia Minor. Why did they like the ancient Greek colonies of the archaic period? Well, because these were colonies without an empire. Once you look at it, it seems obvious that American colonists would be looking for examples in antiquity of places that managed to govern themselves just fine, thank you very much, without the interference of the mother country, which is metropolis in Greek. Right, Barry? That's right? Okay, that's where we get our word metropolis. Okay. Finally, and this is what I'm going to focus on with a couple more minutes tonight, is the first empire in the history of the world. That was ancient Persia, which at its height in 500 BCE was the largest empire in world history, occupying what are now over 20 modern nation states, including Iran and Iraq. Ancient Persia is everywhere in the imagination of the American founders. Students feeling left out today of an alleged classical heritage or Western civilization, both terms and concepts not coined until the turn of the 20th century, can take comfort in knowing that the United States is founded on some of the ideals of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, and his successors, Darius and Xerxes, as well as other Persians who have been lost to history. Why did they love the ancient Persians? They loved the military strategy of these expert soldiers. Cyrus the Great was frequently compared to George Washington, or I should say George Washington was frequently compared to Cyrus the Great. He was not just a fabulous horseman, he took care of his men, just like Cyrus the Great did in his many battles around the enormous Persian Empire. They also loved his military strategy, his secret weapon of sending really smelly camels to the front of the line such that they would terrify the horses of the enemies. Now, I don't think that George Washington used this strategy in the American Revolution, but they read about it in this era and they loved it, and they talked a lot about it. So they loved the Persians, compared them to George Washington. They also loved the Persian Empire qua empire, When Americans Brexited from Great Britain in 1776, they did not reject all empires. They simply rejected the top-down version of empire that Britain was intending to impose upon them. They immediately began to form their own empire to the west as they trickled over the Appalachians into what they would call the Northwest Territory and beyond. They invoked the Persian Empire as a model of an enormous territorial empire that was extremely well governed by a king of kings, Cyrus the Great, and by a series of infrastructure moves that they proceeded to apply. One was the royal roads of the Persians, which extended all the way from the city of Sardis in the far west of Asia Minor, all the way to the eastern Indian fringes of the Persian Empire. They wanted to model the roads that would extend through the Northwest Territory on the royal road of the Persian Empire, which you could cross all 1,500 miles of in a matter of under 2 weeks. This was because of the fabulous system of horse exchange posts that they set up along that royal road. All of this was observed through Herodotus, through Xenophon, and other Greek writers, and studied by the American founders. Finally, they loved the Persian postal system, and they wanted to model the US postal system upon it. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Today, that is the motto of the United States postal system. It is from Herodotus, describing his admiration for the royal postal system of the ancient Persians and their empire. So, as we think in this 250th year of the classicism of the American founders and its role in the establishment of the United States Republic, spare a moment for the contributions of the ancient Persians to the Republic that we stand in today, and remember that the vision of the founders was very broad and very capacious, as we hope that we too can be today in the United States. Thank you.
Well, let me just start by thanking Steve Kotkin for bringing us all together this evening. Thanks also to the college, the Hoover History Lab, and the History Department teams for organizing everything. So I'm going to be talking a bit more specifically about a passage of the Declaration, and we'll be tracing it also back to this time the Greeks, but though with a little cameo of the Persians as well. And I'm not going to be making the usual argument about classical reception. I'm actually going to be arguing that there's a very specific conception of freedom that we find in the Declaration that can be traced back to ancient Greece, but that probably by this point in the 1770s, most people were no longer aware of. So it's sort of more of a almost hidden cultural history that I want to highlight. The passage I want to focus on is not the famous opening, which you've already heard recited tonight, but it's the much less read conclusion. So as you can see here, as they're summing up their arguments, the representatives declare these united colonies to be free and independent states, and then they repeat that phrase a second time. Now, one reason maybe we don't study this part so much is that it's actually not written by Jefferson. It's not even written by anyone else on the Committee of Five. As Pauline Mayer showed, it's actually lifted verbatim from Richard Henry Lee's resolution of that had come a couple weeks before. As you can see, it's exactly the same sentence. Richard Henry Lee himself was actually building on the earlier resolutions of the Virginia Convention, which had this language already there. And though we don't focus too much on this part of the Declaration, this really was the crux of the Declaration. To this, when Congress tasked the Committee of Five with writing a declaration, it was to the effect of Lee's resolution. And so they needed this ultimate speech act to transform the colonies into free and independent states. I mean, that's really where the actual work of the Declaration is happening. But why that phrase? Why free and independent? If you think about it, it starts to seem a little redundant, right? Can you be free and dependent? Can you be unfree and independent? And if not, if they're basically the same thing, why the need to say both words, not only here, but in all these other documents as well? And what I want to submit to you is that if these are, to us, synonymous terms, actually, this was not always the case. Indeed, we can even kind of pinpoint when and where these two ideas became conjoined, and it takes us back to ancient Greece circa 500 BC. All ancient peoples had a word for free, and the Greek word was eleutheros, but originally in Greek, eleutheros just meant that you were free in the sense of not being enslaved. And that's the sense in which most ancient languages had a word for freedom. And so, for instance, in the Iliad, that's the meaning that you find of free. It doesn't appear very often, but it just means that you have not been made a slave. However, as the classicist Kurt Raaflaub showed, once the Greek city-states fell under the shadow of Persian domination, once Persia started expanding, and this is around 500 BC, there was a conceptual shift that took place. Suddenly, the same word which they had used to refer to a civil status was repurposed to refer to a political status. Clearly just on the model of analogy, right? Being subject to Persia would have been like being subject or being enslaved to a master. And we can just sort of see this word appear in its new meaning in the historical record. This is one of the earliest cases. We have Aeschylus's his tragedy on the Persians, which recounts how at the Battle of Salamis, the Greek soldiers chanted this. They urged each other on with a chant defending their freedom. And this is actually, in the historical record, the first use of the verb to free that we have. So here we can see that the meaning of freedom had clearly extended beyond just a civil status. Tombs and temples cannot be literally enslaved, and freedom was now becoming a political and even a cultural value. And what's really fascinating is that at this exact same time, they make another conceptual leap as well. They take this new idea that freedom means political autonomy and also extends it to being free from rule by a tyrant. So that second meaning of freedom is also being developed, and you see it throughout Herodotus. This is just one example among many that I won't spend too much time on because there's so many of them. And this fundamental idea that freedom and tyranny are incompatible, which again, we take for granted, was in a sense invented at this particular moment. That all of these different concepts are now being connected to the same word. And of course, this will continue all the way up to the Declaration of Independence, which similarly contrasts the rule of a tyrant, a Greek word, with the life of a free people. So this is going to become a very central concept in so much of Greek literature, philosophy, and history, and it is also going to be adopted by the Romans. They probably did not make this conceptual leap themselves. I think most historians think that they just sort of adopted the Greek sense, but then they project it back into their own history. So Carolyn was referring to those virtuous Republican Romans after they throw out their king, Tarquinius Superbus, and the very first word of Book 2 of Livy's History of Rome, which will inaugurate the Republican, free, glorious, virtuous phase of the history, is liberi. Free now are the people of Rome. And this is what he will go on to describe. So can we meaningfully, though, connect Herodotus, Livy, and the Declaration of Independence? How can we be sure that this isn't just, some historian standing on a stage making connections for you? Well, the first point to note is actually by the 18th century, this phrase, free and independent states, had already become almost a technical term in legal and international history. In part, I think this derives from its use in the this treaty, important treaty, the Peace of Münster, which ended the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch Republic. And it already has a declaration that states that the States General, the Ordines of the United Netherlands, should be liberos et supremos. And in all of the English translations of this, that phrase is rendered as free and independent. I'm not making a claim that the American framers were familiar with this. They might have been, but they definitely knew Émeric de Vattel. And Vattel picks up on this phrase and makes it actually the unit of international law. International law is what focuses on how free and independent states, libres et indépendants, are interacting with each other. And the Americans loved Vattel. Jefferson's older cousin, Richard Bland, cites him all over his 1766 inquiry into the rights of the British colonies. Washington liked Vattel so much that he never returns his library copy. And in 2010, the estate realizes that they still have this library copy of Vattel, so they dutifully and good citizens return it and are fined $300,000. But the fee is waived. So I think it's pretty clear that the Virginians who resolved to declare the United Colonies free and independent states were aware of this sort of broader legal meaning of the term. But the real question is, can we stretch it back further? Can we make that jump all the way back to antiquity? And in the 3 minutes left that I have, I'll try to give you two other sources of textual evidence that I think suggest that we can. The first are all the Greek histories written by modern or contemporary historians that are describing these Greek states in such terms. So I'll just give you one example. This is Charles Rolland. You probably haven't heard of him, but his authority was such that he's actually cited during the Constitutional Convention in order to resolve the debate over the structure and the scope of the Senate. So he was a big deal in the 18th century, and they read him assiduously. He's French, they read him in translation, but this is just one example where he is using that exact phrase to describe how the Greeks would have thought of their own states, free and independent. And so I think there's a lot of evidence showing that for 18th century historians, at least, this was already sort of a double quality that we can find in these ancient Greek city-states. But one could say that they're just projecting back onto antiquity an idea that had a much more recent genesis. And to that, I would say, well, actually, we can go back to the Greeks themselves. Indeed, Greek historians are often using these same terms in their own description. So this is one example from Thucydides, where the Syracusan general Hermocrates describes the Greeks who live in Sicily as descending from the free Dorians from independent Peloponnese. We have these same terms, eleuteroi and autonomou, that you find in the 18th century. And then in Xenophon, just to give another example, in his continuation of Thucydides' history, he has this great little story about how Midias, who murders his mother-in-law to become a tyrant, then tries to get a Spartan commander to help him, and the Spartan says, you must let your citizens be free and independent. Eleuterus kai autonomus, so exactly that same phrase. And I just actually this afternoon found that there's a whole load of epigraphical evidence. So these were inscriptions that have been found on various monuments throughout ancient Greece that also use this phrase. This is actually from the Roman period, eleutera kai autonomos. It was a status, a legal status in the Roman Empire that gave the city the right to not pay taxes and usually to have its own laws. So I think there's quite a lot of evidence that the idea of freedom that we find expressed in the Declaration of Independence really can be traced back to this distinctly Western concept of freedom that emerges under very particular circumstances in 5th century Greece. In a longer version of this paper, I would describe this definition as peripheral, meaning that it's the kind of idea of freedom, definition of freedom, that you get when you are on the periphery of very powerful empires, like the Persians. And the Greeks are clearly not the only ones who find themselves on the periphery of powerful empires, and they're certainly not the only ones who would rather be independent and who might even fight to the death to retain their independence. But that's the rub. It seems, as far as I can tell, that, and I already gave away my climatic conclusion, that there's no other language in the ancient world besides Greek and then by extension Latin that adds this political meaning to the word, the civil word for freedom. And the Greeks then managed to retain their independence, their freedom, long enough to preserve and produce this literary culture that celebrated a certain idea of political freedom all the way down to 1776. Thank you. Yeah, there you go.
So I must confess, it's a little bit terrifying to be running the anchor leg after these 3 wonderful presentations, but I'll do my best to bring it home. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those, of course, are very famous words that I think I'm now the third person maybe to repeat this evening to you. They're deeply rooted in Enlightenment philosophy. They are the second sentence of our Declaration of Independence. And they are among the most famous and influential words, I think, ever committed to paper. In fact, Walter Isaacson has recently declared them the greatest sentence ever written. Today, however, we largely treat them as a bit of poetry, a rhetorical flourish designed to inspire, but without legal meaning or import. The real action, we're inclined to think, and I think, Dan, you set this up very nicely, doesn't come at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, but rather at the end, where these united colonies declare themselves to be free and independent states. But that was not always the case. For the founding generation, and indeed for generations thereafter, the Declaration's assertion that all men were created equal and other similar such phrases found in founding era texts was not merely an expression of principle, but a statement imbued with potentially explosive legal consequences, specifically for the institution of slavery. And in the short time that I have here today with you, I want to briefly explore these radical and emancipatory implications in these universalist claims. Now, this most famous phrase in the Declaration, for all its grandeur, is, I got to admit, a little bit of a cut and paste job. It is inspired by a similar phrase that had been introduced at a convention that framed Virginia's Declaration of Rights just a few months before. At this convention in May of 1776, George Mason, a man Thomas Jefferson saw as a mentor, and later described as the wisest man of his generation, offered the initial draft. This initial draft declared that all men are born equally free and independent, and have certain inherent natural rights, of which they cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity. This soaring assertion provoked immediate, heated, and prolonged discussion. Such words, after all, struck at the very foundations of a slaveholding society, a society built on the belief that some could be reduced to slavery by others, a society that by the late 18th century embraced the idea that racial difference made men inherently unequal. Debate over this first article lasted for days, precisely because delegates believed that such words had not only moral, but legal force, and that they would create an obligation to respect the rights of all people, including the enslaved. In order to ensure that that didn't happen, Mason's original text was ultimately amended. When the dust settled and a final draft was adopted, Article 1 of Virginia's Declaration of Rights instead declared that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity. These alterations, the vast majority of them, 3 of them, are specifically designed to exempt enslaved people from the language of this article. Men, of course, could not be born equally free and independent in a place where slavery was practiced, where slavery was a hereditable condition, a status that one acquired through one's birth, right? So out has to go any reference to freedom being a condition one is born into. Likewise, while natural rights had to be respected, inherent rights were a little bit more ambiguous for those in the 18th century. Unlike natural rights, inherent rights could perhaps be granted or withdrawn by civil authorities. Finally, and most importantly, we get to the significant qualification that it is only those who have entered into a state of society who cannot be deprived or divested of their rights. And by late 18th century understandings, this, of course, directly excluded the enslaved. Such changes make plain, I think, how acutely aware Virginia elites were that Universalist claims indeed did apply to all men. In order to blunt their power to undermine slavery, they had to be artfully rewritten. If Virginia elites defanged their own all men are article by adding qualifications and carve-outs, however, enslaved people elsewhere took advantage of such language to claim their freedom. The most successful of these efforts during the Revolutionary era took place in Massachusetts, whose state constitution, drafted by John Adams and ratified in 1780, declared all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. Almost immediately after the Massachusetts state constitution became law, enslaved people in the Bay State began using them in an effort to establish that they were entitled to their freedom. They did so in a series of what are called freedom suits, lawsuits filed by those held in slavery who assert that in fact they are free. A woman named Mumbet, later known as Elizabeth Freeman, was the first to do so in 1781, just a year after the adoption of the Massachusetts state constitution. Her case was enjoined with that of another man known as Brom, and at trial that August in 1781, Bet and Brom's attorney asserted that the two of them could no longer be held as slaves because the Massachusetts Constitution, specifically Article 1, rendered slavery unconstitutional in the state. The court set Bet and Brom free and awarded them 30 shillings in damages. The man who had claimed them then appealed to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. But before that appeal was heard, the same body affirmed the principle on which Bet and Brom had based their freedom suit. And ultimately, it liberated another freedom suit plaintiff named Quock Walker. Here you can see an image of Elizabeth Freeman, of course, made later in her life after she had gained her freedom. When Quock Walker's case arrived at the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, the Chief Justice of that body instructed the jury, now quite famously, that the framers of our Constitution of Government declared that all men were born free and equal, and every subject is entitled to liberty and to have it guarded by the laws as well as his life and property. And in short, this language is totally repugnant to the idea of being born slaves. This being the case, I think the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our own conduct and Constitution. The jury ultimately agreed. Quock Walker became a free man, and through his efforts, slavery officially ended in Massachusetts. These two episodes constituted something like the opening chapter of an ongoing debate over the meaning and purpose of the most celebrated language in the Declaration of Independence. Stories like these would continue until the Civil War, as Americans fought over who exactly constituted all men and what rights were due to them. As we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of the United States, I think we would do well to take seriously these words, as the founding generation did, and the extraordinary power that they held, not just as a source of inspiration, but as a legally binding text. Thank you.
All right, well, those were really rich and wonderful remarks from all of our panelists. So to kick things off with some questions, I'm going to start with one that is broad, that tries to integrate what all of you said, and is perhaps something of a provocation. So I think one way to understand what each of you were doing in common was suggesting that the intellectual world or imagination that produced the Declaration of Independence, in key respects, saw its central concepts in a broader, more capacious, more integrated way than perhaps we do anymore. So one way to think about this is people in the 18th century, as you all spoke to, didn't draw distinctions between, but melded what we might think of as distinct forms of knowledge: political theory, moral philosophy, rhetoric, the classics, education, law. And instead of seeing them as separate, saw how they reinforced one another, and that this was part of the project of understanding how the foundation of freedom itself needed to be broader. Of course, the notion of freedom itself, both Barry and Dan spoke to eloquently, was in some ways much broader, perhaps, in the 18th century. So is perhaps one way to reflect upon the 250th anniversary that we have ended up with slightly cramped versions of some of these things, and by reacquainting ourselves with the broader resonances and connections that perhaps we might see a broader way of understanding freedom and what it entails.
Yes.
Great.
I mean, I love that point, because I think that one of the big changes that happened between 1776 and today is one that we're sitting in the middle of, right? It's sort of the rise of the university, the rise of the research university, the departmentalization of knowledge, and of course, that's very foreign to this world, right? That they didn't say, oh, well, that's a history book, so, or that's a law, right? You're right, it was much more integrated. And I think there's something about sort of the kind of classical education also that Barry was describing that was really the only place we still have it today is kind of in our general education, right? It was designed not to produce a professional. It was a liberal education. It was the education that all free people should have, and so it didn't have the kind of narrowness that I think you're rightly pointing to.
Yeah, that was a terrific weaving together of four quite disparate comments. So bravo, first of all. And I would, I think, also add that not uniquely among modern nations, but distinctively, the United States is founded on documents. Our wonderful colleague, Pauline Mayer, called the Declaration and the Constitution, American scripture, that lacking origins, actually in ancient Rome, no matter what you read on the web, right? The Phoenicians did not found the United States, et cetera. The United States was in search of, and is in search of what it means to begin, what our beginnings are, and how we should look at them. And because we don't have monuments from antiquity, we don't have, traditions that go back thousands of years. It's 250 years old. That's it, from the founding of the Republic. And the fact that we have to look at these documents, these parchment barriers, says James Madison of the US Constitution, parchment barriers against chaos, parchment barriers against tyranny. they can sometimes seem very remote to us. These are old documents. They're written in 18th century language, which I know because I teach the 18th century courses here, as Jonathan does as well. 18th century script is hard to read. The S's look like F's. The problems multiply from there. It's important for us to go back and refresh them by understanding them on their own terms, but also to recognize that it is difficult to access these old documents. You know, they are in the present because we bring them into the present, but we have to bring the understanding and generosity of the historian to go back in time and to understand them on their own terms. So I would say that, you know, the national duty of Americans is to acquire the historical sensibilities, to do justice to the people in the past, to try to understand those words that so easily slip from our fingers, like free and independent states. So, yes, again.
And just following up on those excellent remarks, we can also make them our own, as Lincoln tried to do. You know, he said that these are what these words really mean. And of course, he put an emphasis on equality that, although as Anne's talk shows, was there for those who wanted to see it. He saw it, and he made it central to what he was doing. So yes, parchment barriers, but he tried to make them into living words. And I think that's what we need to do as well.
I think there's sometimes this real sense that the Declaration and the Constitution and other founding era documents are discrete from one another. We tend to treat the Constitution as law, and everything else as these kind of sort of aspirational political documents, but not holding the same kind of character. And I think what's really striking, if you spend time in the late 18th century and certainly the first half of the 19th century, is Americans are routinely making reference to both at the same time. I mean, today it's become, I think, you know, it's a form of sort of pedantry to point out that most Americans think that all men are created equal is in the Constitution and not the Declaration. And obviously, yes, on one hand, and we should do more to make sure that people understand, you know, the content of one document as opposed to the other. But actually, like in a real way, I think that gets at the kind of capaciousness of the ways that Americans use these documents for our first sort of century, at least, that they didn't see any sort of bright line distinction. That, I mean, often the analogy is that the Constitution is a frame, but the Declaration is the image, right? Which actually, I think, inverts our understanding, our expectations about which is the more important of these two sort of founding texts. That you cannot separate the kind of letter of the law, maybe the way that we start to think about the Constitution, like a kind of lawyer's document, from the soaring oratorical claims that appear both in the preamble but also in the Declaration of Independence, that they are inextricably intertwined with one another, and to understand the Constitution necessitates an understanding of the purposes for which that Constitution was created, which are embodied in the Declaration.
Wonderful. So I'm going to turn it over to the audience shortly, but I'll ask one more question to sort of open things up. So, you know, Barry, you alluded to living words, and one of our sort of things we can reflect on this evening is how has the Declaration and its ideas been used and transformed since the 18th century? And picking up on the context that Dan drew attention to, one way to understand what it's doing in the late 18th century is it's about a collective sense of equality, the capacity for Americans as one people to take their equal place among the powers of the earth and exercise a right of sort of collective self-determination that's more sort of outward-facing. A different notion of an equality is about individual autonomy. And I think, as Annie was drawing attention to, right from the beginning, a certain number of people give it that reading. A lot of abolitionists in the 19th century gave it that reading, but also there is that broader collective democratic reading. How should we understand the relationship between the two? drawing on their classical education, drawing on their influences, thinking about the relationship between the 18th century and now, what's different, what lives, how they should be melded together. Do they fit together nicely in harmony? Are they somewhat at odds? How should we think about that?
Well, going back to the Greeks, I think the Greeks might have said that democracy is based on freedom and equality, but it's kind of a seesaw. You know, if you just have freedom, then I am free to take away your equality. And if you just have equality, then there's a leveling effect, and not everybody can exercise their freedom all the way. So the real question is how you balance those two things.
The founders thought the Greeks were kind of nutty. They didn't like their democracy. They thought that it was a really bad idea. And that's why they loved the Romans. And they loved that the Romans had this balanced, movement of aristocracy, monarchy, and common people. So in that sense, the context, how do we make these documents present to us today? You know, the classicism or even the Persians are not mentioned either in the Declaration of Independence or in the Constitution, so you have to sort of reinsert them, right, as you go. But understanding that fundamentally these two documents are not rooted in a Greek tradition that was frightening to the founders, even though I agree with everything you said, Dan, about free and independent states, most of Greece was just terrifying to them. And it wasn't until the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s, especially the Greek independence movement, that Americans latched on to ancient Greece and began by 1900 to imagine that they were part of this glorious Western civilization that began with the Greeks. This thought would have appalled the founders in the 18th century. They wanted really nothing to do with such a genealogy. So restoring that context to these two documents, what they loved, what they feared, is really important for our understanding today of how we think about other times and places and their importance to our national dialogue today.
They do like the Greek leagues, confederacies. I find that kind of interesting. But you're right, like the Athenians
and the colonies
and the democracy. That's scary stuff. I think there's an interesting question that your question inspires, and I don't have an answer to, which is like words like liberty, like equality. Montesquieu, in The Spirit of the Laws, already comments. There are like 60 different meanings of liberty, right? These are intrinsically, Professor Kotkin was referring to this in his introductory remarks, like these are intrinsically conflicted and contested concepts. And I think everybody knew that. The question though is, were they intentionally using these concepts in a way that was fairly vague in order to try and mobilize as many different people, like talk to both the abolitionists and the Virginia slaveholders, and kind of just not really emphasize the fault lines? Was that intentional, or do we need to kind of try and figure out, well, what really did they mean here? And I'll just leave that as an open question.
They had such a capacious understanding, I think, there is this tradition in which these words, these phrases have appeared, and those inform. But the tradition is not just sort of one tradition. I mean, maybe this gestures towards, I think, what Carolyn's saying. Just because we can talk about kind of like the Enlightenment philosophy that undergirds so many of their ideas, it doesn't mean that there aren't tensions, I think, within those ideas. And I think that maybe there's something to this sort of idea that today we tend to view compromise as a fairly sort of dirty word, but in fact, actually to create any kind of governing document, right? This aspect of everyone needing to be able to sort of see a future in that, or coming out of that they want to be part of, right, is essential to the project. If you can't get multiple constituencies to sort of buy in, to an idea, then it's never going to get off the ground. So the very capaciousness of the ideas, I think, is part of the strength here.
And that connects nicely to Carolyn's opening thought of when you're actually in the field of action, starting a new nation, you can have a pragmatic cast to your approach in which you try to fit together things that from a different perspective, one might see tension. So I have a whole bunch more questions and things I'd ask about, but I'd love to hear from the audience. So for those who have questions for our panelists about things said tonight, please raise your hand. I don't know if there are gonna be microphones going around or we'll just speak up. Looks like we have microphones in the audience. So I see there's a question over here I saw, and then one in the middle.
I'm Robert. I'm a sophomore studying history. You talk about how the Greeks and the Romans were interpreted by our founding fathers. I guess in response to that founding moment, how did the rest of the world interpret the American experiment? What were some really, interesting, different interpretations that kind of built upon that across the world that you want to talk about?
I can talk about the French.
Yeah.
I think it's the two things. There's a lot of enthusiasm, right? And there's this sense that, these Americans, they're like children. They're like bringing back the ancient times. There's a kind of condescending view, but there is an excitement that old Europe and its palaces, and yes, they have all the monuments, but the monuments are crumbling, and Europe feels old to itself, and so they get this sort of youthful vigor from the Americans, and I think they don't actually see it as too threatening. I don't think that they're necessarily looking at the Americans and saying, it's Louis XVI who's funding the American Revolution after all, right? I mean, they don't see this as a danger to their own regimes, in large part, because I hate to say this, but America's this like kind of backwater on the other side of the Atlantic, right? They're not part of the great power game. So they can almost afford to be enthusiastic because they don't see America as a threat. So that's just sort of the view from France. But.
Yeah, well, the British were unhappy.
Only some of them.
Yeah. And tried again in the War of 1812 to recolonize. But I think, many states in Europe, I can't speak for the world beyond Europe because I don't know the response, of the rest of the world, and maybe there are people in this room who can, but the rest of Europe, whatever issues they might have, is also kind of excited by this. We focus on this as a moment of break with monarchy, but the fact of the matter is, there's still monarchies today, and Britain never got rid of theirs, and there's a ton of monarchies in the world of the 18th century. And the Americans sort of offer a glimpse of what a world can look like beyond monarchy and beyond empire. In some senses, the Declaration is the first post-colonial document, and you can see it as a domino effect leading to the post-colonial revolutions of the 20th century. This is the beginning, if you like to trace genealogies of that kind. And that's one of the reasons why the Declaration has found 20th century voices using that inspiring language at the beginning, not the boring 27 charges against George III that nobody reads unless you take History 150A at Stanford, and then you do read it. But I actually don't know beyond Europe what the rest of the world's response is, beyond Europe and South America, where they're terrified. The Spanish are terrified that this could happen, and then it does happen as their empire begins to decay in South America through the Latin American independence movements.
I wanted to pick up on Carolyn's remarks just to suggest that the concept of Western civilization, which is also in the title of the panel, seems to me to be a belated invention with its own history, and really not true to the ancient world, given the sorts of things that Carolyn, you were talking about, but you could even go beyond. I mean, the influence of Babylonian, Persian, North African, South Asian, there's all these influences. There's also a kind of elaborately networked, the ancient world is sort of full of networking and exchange and all of that. So it seems to me that the concept of Western civilization itself, again, I'll just repeat it, I just said it a moment ago, it's a belated invention with its own history and its own message, and really not true to the ancient world. Discuss.
I would just say, that's a great point, but I would have to say yes and no. It depends who you're asking in the ancient world. So someone like Herodotus really would agree with you and say that the ancient world is a vast place with many different cultures and peoples, and as Greeks we want to understand our place in it. But there are others, particularly others who would respond, say, to the Greco-Persian Wars by saying, we're the Greeks, we are the best, we're on top. The Persians represent despotism. They represent enslavement. We are the Greeks who represent freedom. Of course, there's hypocrisy in that, since ancient Greece depends on enslaved labor. But I think there is this sense of us and them that goes back to the Greeks, and certainly the Romans had it as well. So there are different voices in the ancient world. Some would agree that Western civilization is artificial, but others would say, no, that's not true. The West is about a certain notion of political freedom, and it makes us different from everyone else.
So the idea that there is the West and the East is not born until the 19th century, and the idea of Western civilization capitalizes on that. So Gibbon, the great historian of Rome, whose History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is published precisely in 6 volumes between the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, very lovely, he says the boundary between East and West is really blurry. It's a blah. It doesn't really exist. The action moves all over the place. So the idea of Western civilization as it develops around 1900 is an ideology, it's an ideological construction that, like all ideologies, is used for a purpose. Everybody has ideologies, and we use them to do things in the world. And the important thing for us, I think, is to know that precisely because it is invented at a certain moment, there is a time before it is invented. And that people thought about the world in different ways, which accounts precisely for the fluidity of the mind of the founders and by the way, founding fathers is not a term that the founding fathers use. Just like the classics didn't know that they were classics, that's not a word that's used in the ancient world. The founding fathers aren't the founding fathers until the late 19th century, so everything is a construction. But the founders in the 18th century could slide easily into the world of the Persians. They could slide easily into the world of the Carthaginians because they didn't have a sense that they were on the defensive against something that was scary and impenetrable. Now, sometimes, the Persians are scary, right? As they come knocking on the door in 490 BC, they're super terrifying. But interestingly, the big historians, for example, that are used today as a kind of example of Greek realpolitik were not read very much in the 18th century. Thucydides is the prime example of that. He's nowhere in the American college curriculum in the 18th century. Only Herodotus and Homer and Xenophon are there. So this kind of warlike us versus them posture is a later imposition that gets amplified in Western civilization courses that are anxious to trace a lineage of democracy.
So I'm going to disagree with both of those positions for 2 reasons. First of all, this is a common criticism that a lot of classicists make, and I actually just think it's empirically wrong that Westerns, like sort of everything we're calling Western is invented in the 19th century. So here's a quote from Hobbes, Leviathan, 1650. In these Western parts of the world, we are made to receive our opinions concerning the institution and rights of commonwealth from Aristotle, Cicero, and other men. There was never anything so dearly bought as these Western parts have bought the learning of the Greek and Latin tongues. And actually, I even think you can trace this even farther back. There's a way in which the Greeks and the Romans thought of themselves as to the west of the Persians. This sort of idea of being Western, it's found in the Greeks already in the way they call, what's the word for Asia Minor? Anatolia. That means the rising sun. It's quite interesting, the Greeks, unlike most other cultures, did not think that they were at the center of the world. And you see this even in the Middle Ages with the TO maps. Europe is not the center. Jerusalem is the center. And this is long before the Crusades. This is already the time of Isidore of Seville. So I actually think that this argument that's quite popular now, that Western civilization is this kind of 19th century imperialist ideology is just empirically wrong. But I'd even go farther, which is to say that I think we've inherited a kind of impoverished definition of what a culture is. We kind of just see cultures as being an assembly of parts. So like there was a recent book by Penelope Quinn, like how the world made the West, and the argument's basically, well, there's no such thing as Western culture because the Greeks are getting all these ideas from the Persians, from the Phoenicians. They got our alphabet from the Phoenicians. We got our myths from the Egyptians. Ergo, Greek is just kind of an assemblage. Sort of a version of Martin Bernal's old argument in Black Athena. But I think what this misses is that every culture also kind of has a culture of culture. It has its own sense of like, what are the important genres? What are the things we should focus on? Where should we invest our cultural energy? And so, there was a moment when this was used indeed as a kind of cultural imperialism in the West. Like I'm thinking of the time when Saul Bellow had that unfortunate remark, who are the Tolstoys among the Zulus? And it's such a stupid thing to say because Tolstoy is writing a novel. He's writing this genre that comes out of a certain Western tradition. It's like saying, who are the great polyrhythmic drummers of Luxembourg? Right? These are just very different senses of what is culturally important. But where I'm getting at of all of this is that I think that what we still have today, look at the way we have structured the university, look at the genres that we are still writing in today, that division, that sort of way of organizing a culture, for large part does go back to ancient Greece and to some extent to the Romans. And so I think that, the label, like the specific words, Western civilization, I mean, there's a history of that. But that label is just being affixed to something that you can recognize at almost every point in European history.
Do we have time for one more question? Plenty of time. All right. Are there other questions? Yes? You've got the mic coming your way.
Thanks. So in parts of the world where we're interested in like the spread of democracy that don't identify themselves with the West or the Western canon or like our classical text, how do we think about getting people to rederive these same ideas from history or from their own culture's principles without drawing on the Greeks or the Romans?
Well, we know that in China, people are studying ancient Greek philosophy. I think they too will want to draw from this well, which is not to say that they don't have their own traditions and their own way of doing things, but you don't have to be from the West to study the legacy of Greece and Rome. And so I think it can be universal.
If I could just add to that, I mean, most of the peoples we think of as Western today, they weren't Greek, they weren't Roman. It's kind of fascinating actually the way in which like these Franks, the Germanic invaders who come in and largely like topple the Roman Empire. A couple hundred years later, they're the ones who are writing in Latin and are reviving a culture that they contributed to knock over. And I think there's an interesting way in which going back to the Greeks, especially the Athenians, really try to invent a kind of universal culture. Now, it's not universal. It's still like Greek. It's very Greek. It's very Athenian. But they nonetheless do try to departicularize culture in ways that could make it accessible to anyone. And to some extent, like, they're pretty successful at that. You know, the Romans come along and say, oh, we want to be like you, right? They self-Hellenize, you know, and the same process that's going to happen over and over again. So, I mean, as Barry was saying, like, there's a way in which it can happen just by adopting these ideas, or there's other sources as well for many of the political forms that maybe we would like, or they would like to see.
I'll just add that there's a Greek writer, Isocrates, who says, we call Greek anyone who shares our culture. Whatever their ethnicity is, whatever their nationality is, if they share Greek culture, then they're Greek.
My name's Felipe. I'm studying history and political science. There seems to be a sentiment, I think, in each of your remarks, the conversation, even maybe the initiative that Hoover's planning out, that the ideas that made us, the history you're touching on, has been largely lost in America. I'm curious if you have hypotheses as to when that happened, how that happened, why that happened. Feel free to take any of those questions. Thank you.
I mean, I will say, this is in my own kind of vein of sort of legal history, but deeply influenced by Jonathan's work as well. The Constitution at some point became a kind of lawyer's document. Law schools came to exist, and they teach a thing called constitutional law. And I think that there has been a kind of real retreat or abdication, I think, from this earlier notion, the notion that was live at the time that the Constitution was created, that it was supposed to be a sort of people's document, open for the people to interpret and to breathe life into and to do with what they will. And I will also sort of add that in addition to this kind of notion that the Constitution is something special that only lawyers know how to read and understand, that I also think, more recently, the problems that we have altering our Constitution make it a kind of dead letter, right? I mean, it not only have you made it a kind of specialized thing that maybe only a certain sort of segment of society feels the expertise to really kind of opine on, it has become a document that is no longer alive in the sense that it is changing and growing sort of with the people and with different conceptions of what a good government, I think, should look like. So I think the kind of calcification of the Constitution, which is a relatively recent phenomenon, has definitely sort of contributed to, I think, a sort of pre-existing sort of notion, lawyers latching their claws into the document and claiming sort of special expertise or authority.
I was going to say, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the popularity of the musical Hamilton, which suggests that there is a thirst to know about the American past and about the American founding. And in an earlier generation, at the time of the bicentennial, in the 1970s, there was the musical 1776, which also speaks to a popular desire to learn more about the American founding. I mean, it shouldn't simply be in musicals, great as they are, that we go back to the past. I just don't know how much they're taught in school. I don't know how much these things are taught in American schools. I suspect not as much as they used to be. And that's an issue as well.
I'll just quickly speak to, I think, an irony that is worth dwelling on. That on the one hand, when Thomas Jefferson was asked about the ideas in the Declaration of Independence late in life, he famously wrote a letter that he didn't have any novel thoughts in there. He was merely saying what was common sense and well known among Americans, which plays, of course, on the idea of self-evident truths, that there are certain things that ordinary people with ordinary capacities can know to be true simply through observation. Thomas Paine's common sense that does so much to provoke Americans to decide to declare independence traffics in a similar idea. So there is this tension where the Declaration and the ideas working properly is so woven into the social fabric and sort of shared consciousness that you don't even realize you're learning something, But at the same time, they were acutely aware that unless the citizenry was well informed, what they said over and over again, none of the institutions they set up, none of the principles they held dear would work. So there's both this need to ensure through sort of active education of the broadest cultural kind that people are well informed, but also this belief or hope that the ideas will be to truly work, must be so deeply internalized that almost they're taken for granted. And there's a tension there that you can then reflect upon how people have been taking them so much for granted that they're gone, potentially.
And Jefferson also did say in that letter that the ideas originally came from Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. So.
He did.
You know, Felipe, you were in History of Ideas with me, and so you know that history is complicated. Ideas are complicated. A lot of stuff happens, it's confusing, and we historians have a hard time getting a handle on all of this stuff. And you know, the poor general public just minding their own business, you know, right now, how can we expect them to go into the past and understand it in all of its complexity? It's a big ask. It's a big ask that the United States makes of its citizens, you know, to understand these founding documents on their own terms, in their own context. So I'm very sympathetic to the struggles that people have in going back to the 18th century. It's really, really difficult.
I thought he pointed past me there for a second. But thank you guys so much. I think the main question I have is, when you go about applying historical lessons or your observations from history to the modern day, how do you best do that in a way to avoid like anachronism and like make it actually palatable for people? Because I think one of the issues with the field of studying in the past for the past couple of decades has been it's often been hard for the general public to understand the lessons we can glean from classical leadership or whatever else it may be. And how do you guys avoid that? How do you recommend that, like, us as amateur historians or aspiring historians also avoid that going forward?
Well, great question. I would say come to the Hoover History Lab, where Professor Kotkin is leading us in doing that sort of thing, in applying history to modern day lessons. And I guess I would say, not being flippant, you have to be humble when you do it, because one of the worst mistakes you can make is to say the lessons of history are A, B, C, D, E. It doesn't really work that way. You have to understand the differences and the similarities and try to go back and forth between what happened then, what's happening now, and open your mind. I'm afraid I'm not giving you a very clear answer, but it's a tremendously difficult problem, and yet the stakes are so high, and it's so worth it, because we do learn from the past. But we have to be careful about how we do it.
I will just say, I mean, I think one of the, for all of Carolyn's sort of observations, which I think are right about sort of 18th century documents and 18th century speak feeling somewhat foreign, actually the biggest problem is they're similar enough that we can import all of our assumptions and project all of our assumptions onto them. We see words and we say, we know what that means. I know what that means. I know what that means to me today as a person who was born maybe in the 1900s, but maybe in the 2000s, right? And I think most importantly, it's the sort of don't assume that you understand the meaning of the words just because we use the same, just because it's written in English and you speak English and you know those words and you know what you think of as the meaning of those words, right? So it's, I mean, I think sometimes it's about not being, I think as Barry sort of like dogmatic about like, well, this is what's in this document, and these are what these words mean, and so we already know. Case closed, we're not going to investigate it any further. That actually spending time thinking through, but what did they mean? Or, I mean, I think to Dan's presentation, here's a phrase, free and independent states, that maybe you've thought about and maybe you've never thought about, but almost, I mean, I think almost sort of every phrase, every complaint even that you could find in the Declaration of Independence, right, has a much longer lineage. There's something there if only you're willing to investigate it.
I'd like to thank everyone for your erudition, civic engagement, sense of paradox. Freedom is very precious. How do I know that? I've spent my whole life studying unfreedom, authoritarian regimes. And I got to tell you, freedom is better. When I was a student at a different institution, I went to Washington for my first time. And I was given a copy of the Constitution, which I still have to this day. And occasionally, not every day, but occasionally, I will read it, even though it's not my subject of study, like it is for the panelists. And I have to say, I highly recommend the text for everybody. The paradoxes are deep. The liberal side of our political spectrum, they detest Western civilization in some ways, and they love the EU. The conservative side of our political spectrum, they detest the EU, and they love Western civilization. And I ask myself, how can we potentially reconcile such paradoxes? Maybe we can't always find consensus, but we can strive to find consensus. As you heard, the category citizen was universal in principle, but exclusionary in practice. Over time, that universalism in principle became more and more actual, more real. It was a struggle. It was a struggle by citizens to open up the category citizen and by non-citizens to open up that category and make it live up to its universal principle, its universal promise. That's what this panel tonight has been about. That's what we encourage you to take up, that challenge, because it never ends. There will be more dialogues on freedom and ideas that made America here at the Hoover Institution during the course of this special year, but I couldn't think of a better panel to kick us off. I'm deeply grateful to Professor G and to all of our panelists. Please join us for the reception outside. Thank you, everybody.